the two dominant ethnic groups. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a broader, effectively a Cold War in the region, where we're seeing the Sunni sect on one side with Saudi Arabia at the helm and the Gulf states, and we're seeing Iran on behalf of the Shiite sect and its satellites battling for supremacy in the region. And there's a very grave concern that Jordan will try and look towards more radical movements, will find common language now with Hamas, and that will certainly pose a great problem for Israel.
Yeah. We've got a clip to go to which focuses on the Jordanians developing closer ties with Hamas.
Hamas's Politburo chief Khalid Mishal is expected to make an official visit to Jordan in the coming days to meet with King Abdullah. An important shift is taking place in Jordan as the country's leaders are starting to take a much more proactive stance in trying to prevent the backlash of the Arab Spring in countries like Syria and Egypt from threatening the Hashemite kingdom's hold on power. Though the Jordanian government lives in deep tension with its majority Palestinian population, part of the evolving Jordanian strategy entails making very public steps to improve its relationship with Hamas. Over the past several weeks, there have been several movements out of Jordan that have been very much out of character for the Hashemite regime, yet have been very revealing of how Jordan is viewing the growing uncertainties in its neighborhood. Jordan is preparing for a visit by Hamas Politburo chief Khalid Mishal, who's currently based in Damascus, to make an official visit to Amman along with Qatar's crown prince after Eid al-Adha. In setting the mood for the upcoming visit, Jordan's new prime minister said Monday that the government's decision in 1999 to expel Hamas leaders, including Mishal, was a, quote, constitutional and political mistake. The Jordanian authorities have a fundamental crisis with the Palestinians. The country's Hashemite rulers were transplanted from the Arabian Peninsula to rule over a territory that is now predominantly inhabited by Palestinians. Jordan thus views groups like Hamas and any bid for Palestinian statehood as a direct threat to the sustainability of the Hashemite monarchy. This is why Jordan has a very healthy relationship with Israel, which shares common cause with the Jordanian government in keeping the Palestinians contained. That said, Jordan does place limits on its relationship with Israel, as it did in '97 when Jordan saved Mishal from an Israeli assassination attempt in Amman. Jordan sees the need to continue to engage Islamist organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas. On the domestic front, Jordan has not been immune to demonstrations inspired by the Arab Spring. Most of the demonstrations have been led by the political arm of the Jordanian Brotherhood called the Islamic Action Front. But these demonstrations have been markedly different from those taking place in neighboring Arab countries. Jordan has a much more open relationship with its opposition, and the demonstrations in Jordan have been pretty contained. The opposition in Jordan is very aware of its limits and is not calling for complete regime change. Still, the government doesn't feel like it's completely dodged the bullet, and the Jordanian Brotherhood has been pushing in its negotiations with the government to welcome Hamas back to Amman. Jordan is also looking nervously at the political transition taking place in Egypt. Though Jordan is happy to see the military regime in Egypt maintain control, they can see that the government in Cairo will increasingly have its hands full in trying to contain its domestic opposition while trying to keep Hamas hemmed in Gaza. Then there's the situation in Syria, where al-Assad's political problems are growing. A great deal of tension exists between Jordan and the Syrian regime that's allied with Iran, but Jordan also relied on Syria for a long time to play its part in keeping Hamas in check. A lot of Hamas's finances, for example, run through Hamas's Politburo, which moved to Damascus in 2001. Now that the Syrian regime is distracted, Jordan is growing concerned about Egypt's and Syria's abilities to keep Hamas in check, and is now trying to take matters into its own hands. Jordan also shares an interest with Egypt in trying to distance Hamas from Iran's orbit of influence and deny Iran a strong foothold in the Levant region. On the home front, Jordan's government can also use improving ties with Hamas to gain credibility with the country's Islamist opposition. But Hamas also comes with a lot of baggage. Though Jordan and Israel continue to cooperate very closely, Jordan does not necessarily want to be held responsible by Israel for Hamas's militant actions. Jordan and Israel also don't want to give Hamas an opportunity to gain a strong foothold in Fatah-controlled West Bank to threaten both Jordan and Israel. Still, Jordan may be contemplating the old adage of keeping friends close and enemies closer and making these positive gestures toward Hamas. Hamas also is weighing the merits of warming ties with Jordan. The group understands well that Jordan's intelligence and security apparatus works in very tight coordination with Israel and the United States, and so will be doing whatever it can to clamp down on Hamas's movements. Hamas is looking for a new home, and the Jordanian government may be seriously looking at the prospect of laying out the welcome mat for Hamas for its own strategic interests.
Hello and welcome back to the Middle East Report. Looking at that analysis there, the prospect that Hamas could then soon become the new home to Mashal, who's currently based, the leader of Hamas, who's currently based in Syria, wouldn't that have dangerous implications for the peace process and dangerous implications for Israel's relationship with Jordan?
Yeah, we've seen sort of in the last couple of days this breaking story of Hamas wanting to relocate out of Syria because of al-Assad's actions towards his own people. There's some grave implications from that. I think, firstly, it shows the increasing isolation of the Syrian regime. If Hamas wants nothing to do with you, I think it shows how extreme they've become. But it shows a wedge growing between that triumvirate, which has been in operation for a long time, of Iran being the patron of Syria and also Hamas. So with Hamas trying to distance themselves from that group and perhaps lessen Syria's influence over them, or Iran's influence over them, I think that is a good thing. Hamas is now being courted by the Sunni states, by Qatar, by Turkey. There's talk of Hamas relocating now to Cairo. While that does pose risks, I think there is also perhaps a benefit to come from that. If more moderate states are to be home to Hamas, I think that will lead to some degree of moderacy on Hamas's part. I don't think these states will tolerate the same sort of extremist behavior that we've seen from Hamas based in Syria. But it certainly does pose a challenge, and I think there's another very grave issue here, is that Fatah, which has always been, for all its faults, the more moderate voice of the Palestinian movement, it's becoming more and more isolated and more irrelevant, I think, in the greater region and the greater scheme of the Arab-Israeli conflict. We're seeing now Hamas being courted and Fatah being increasingly isolated and weakened, and that does pose a grave risk for Israel.
And also, we're looking at the peace process. If we actually have one moment, have a look at the peace process. And this is why I think Israel's in such a precarious situation, that if Israel makes peace today, there might be war tomorrow. So if Israel then allows the declaration or a Palestinian state to emerge right on our borders, particularly with the Jordan Valley and with the Jordanian hills overlooking Israel, that within months we could see that Fatah and Mohammed Abbas would be replaced in a coup d'etat by Hamas. Israel would then be locked in with a regime controlling the strategic points over Israel, and Katyusha rockets being fired upon Israel, plus also the danger then that with a future Palestinian state, Hamas would be locked in with Jordan and pose a destabilization effect upon the Hashemites. So, I mean, how can Israel proceed with the peace process with the prospects of this being a frightening and possible reality?
There's a grave challenge there, because when there was a unified Palestinian movement under Yasser Arafat, peace was still not forthcoming, despite incredible offers made at Camp David and prior to that as well, no peace was found. Now we're in a position where the Palestinians seem less prepared for statehood than ever. You've got the Palestinians split both territorially between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, split ideologically between the path advocated by Hamas and advocated by Fatah. They are completely unprepared for statehood, and yet they try and impose a settlement on Israel through unilateral means through the United Nations. Israel desperately wants peace. I think Israel is firmly of the belief that a vibrant and economically stable, politically stable Palestinian state is in Israel's own best interests. And anything that Israel can do to assist in that, in a final, durable and a genuine settlement, it will do. But at this stage, as you said, there are so many issues in play. There is so much division between the Palestinians themselves that the peace process seems to be somewhat illusory at present.
And how can really Israel be expected to make what amounts to incredible territorial concessions for peace when in return she gets rockets. And there is no peace, because peace is about mutual recognition. It's about looking and addressing the education system, as we're seeing with the Palestinian Authority. Media education. They're inciting their children to genocide against Israel and the Jewish people. So how can Israel be expected to give away strategic land for peace when there is no peace?
It's a real challenge, and it's a real flaw in the peace process. This notion of land for peace has always been something which Israel has been prepared to buy into, which is what we saw with Egypt and the peace that Israel managed to find there in exchange for giving up the Sinai Peninsula. And it was also the cornerstone of the peace with Jordan. But at the moment, there doesn't seem to be any way that the Palestinians will be prepared to offer what they need to offer, i.e. peace, in exchange for land. As soon as there is a united Palestinian movement which is capable of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state, which is important, because recognition of Israel's right to exist is largely symbolic, but it's the right to exist as a Jewish state, as a Jewish homeland, which is more paramount. But without these even minor steps, there is very little way of seeing a genuine peace developing between Israel and the Palestinians.
And also, which is also very troubling as well, when we're looking at the strategic outlook in the Middle East and looking at Israel's position within the Arab world. And you start to see the real danger with what's happening in Syria right now, with growing domestic pressure on Bashar al-Assad as he's clamping down on the protesters. I think over 4,000 Syrians have been killed. And also Hezbollah is in trouble for supporting Bashar al-Assad in Syria as well, and they're both backed by the Iranians. Now, could there be a case where the Iranians feeling increasingly under pressure over their nuclear weapons program? You're having Bashar al-Assad, who's increasingly isolated in the Arab world and in the international court of world opinion, plus also Hezbollah facing trouble as well, that they may instigate a war with Israel in order to deflect that international domestic pressure.
That is a grave concern for Israel. The Arab world has always viewed Israel and the Jews as a very convenient scapegoat. And as soon as al-Assad's trouble started in Syria, this genuine concern emerged that he would use Israel to deflect attention from his own troubles at home, likewise with Lebanon in the north. And that is a very genuine concern. With Iran at the helm, and Iran effectively being the patron of Hezbollah, Hamas, and Syria, and as you said, attempting to deflect attention off their nuclear aspirations, there is a real concern that there will be increasing provocations towards Israel from Iran's satellites on Israel's borders, with the aim of extracting an escalation from Israel and drawing Israel into a deeper regional war. And then with that looming spectre of a nuclear Iran, that becomes all the more dangerous.
And really talking about Iran, I mean, we've seen unprecedented news reports over the past week. We've seen those demonstrators organised by Ahmadinejad's own supporters to storm the British embassy in Tehran, which has resulted in Britain, for safety reasons, pulling out the British ambassador to Iran and all the diplomatic staff. And in return, we've seen very, very strong measures by the British government to expel the Iranian ambassador and the diplomatic staff in return. Are we now entering into a new phase in our relationship with Iran, that we're seeing the end of negotiations and almost the start of the beginning of conflict that could lead to a regional war?
It looks like we're at a very dangerous point, and I think that's largely due to the world's failure to confront Iran earlier. We had the release of the IAEA's report a short time ago, which confirmed that Iran is seeking to acquire nuclear weapons, but there were no bombshells there were no great surprises. It merely confirmed that which Israel had been saying for a number of years. But rather than confronting Iran when the nuclear program was in its infancy, the world instead adopted a policy of appeasement, hoping that by placating Ahmadinejad, he would somehow decide to abandon his nuclear aspirations. But if there's one lesson to be learned from modern history, it's that tyrants will not be appeased. And we've now gotten to a point where, after this report, the world could no longer ignore Iran's nuclear aspirations. And we have seen some meaningful steps to confronting Iran. We've seen the imposition of genuine sanctions. We've seen the downscaling of diplomatic missions from European countries and from Australia as well. because I think the world has finally come to realize that a nuclear Iran would be a great peril. To have this brutal, repressive, belligerent regime in possession of the most dangerous weapon man has ever conceived is just dangerous beyond words, really. And now we're at a point where it's being confronted in a genuine sense, but one wonders whether it's gotten too far, whether it's too late now to challenge this. There's talk that even a military strike on Iran's nuclear facility would merely delay the development of nuclear weapons. So we're really at a crossroads now in the world's relationship with Iran.
Yeah, we've got a news clip to go to now that looks at the expelling of the Iranian ambassador to Britain and his diplomatic staff, and also the attack on the British embassy in Tehran.
25 Iranian diplomats expelled from Britain have arrived home. They were sent back to Tehran following an attack on the British embassy there. Death to England, shouted the protesters. Dozens of students were at the airport to greet their compatriots, but the diplomats were ushered away. The row brings relations between the two countries to a new low, but diplomatic ties have not been cut entirely. We've come here to welcome the Iranian ambassador from the UK, he says. We're very happy that they've returned. We don't need an Iranian embassy there. In London, the expulsion brought protests against the Tehran regime outside the Iranian embassy. Behind the dispute lies the ongoing saga over Iran's nuclear program. Britain's move, along with the US and Canada, to impose new sanctions prompted last Tuesday's attack on the British embassy in Tehran. Iran apologized, but the UK accuses the authorities of backing the protests.
Welcome back to the Middle East Report. Alex, I'm just looking at some of the news headlines, and this is from the Telegraph on Tuesday. It says Iran's forces ordered to be ready for war. Iran's Revolutionary Guards have been put on a war footing amid increasing signs that the West is taking direct action to cripple the country's nuclear program. And we've also seen a proxy war going on in Iran. I mean, we've seen only a few weeks ago the attack on Iran's Shihab-3 missile base with a devastating impact. We've also seen an attack on Iran's nuclear weapons base, I think it's in Isfahan, only last week, and plus also the assassination of many leading Iranian scientists. Is there a danger that this proxy war could lead to a wider war?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a challenge to Iran's nuclear program through somewhat unconventional means. We've seen the measures that you've spoken about. Prior to that, we've seen the Stuxnet virus infect Iran's IT systems, which set back their nuclear program by a good deal of time. I think the world is getting serious. I think the world is starting to understand the gravity of a nuclear Iran, and it's looking for ways to confront this. And a full-blown military strike is in nobody's best interest. No one wants this. There's also questions as to its effectiveness also. So I think the world is looking for more creative ways to stop Iran from acquiring a nuclear capability. And in their response, in mobilizing their Revolutionary Guard, I think we're seeing an increasing isolation and desperation on the part of Iran. They realize they're now finally in a position where they need to either disarm, halt their program, or face dire military consequences. And through those actions, I think we see that they have no intention of disarming whatsoever.
I mean, what's also interesting as well is that in recent weeks, we've seen the rhetoric from the Israeli government. We've seen Ehud Barak, we've seen the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu talking about that if the West doesn't take more serious action against Iran, then Israel would be forced into taking on military action against the Iranian regime, which is something they don't want to do, but feel they have no choice because of the statements that have been made by Ahmadinejad that he has vowed to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. So the prospect of Iran having nuclear weapons will increase their sponsorship of international terrorism. It means this will safeguard them against any future attacks, and the world will be a more dangerous and darker place. Is it coming to that place where we're getting to almost the countdown stage of Israel being forced to take action because of the weakness of the United States government in confronting the threat and the terror posed by the Iranian regime?
I fear that this is where we have gotten to. A nuclear Iran is not just an Israeli problem, and Israel has been saying that for a number of years. nuclear proliferation is in nobody's best interest, particularly, as I said, when that weapon would be in the possession of such a brutal and belligerent regime. The consequences of a nuclear Iran span, as I said, far beyond Israel. We are talking about Iran trying to increase its presence in the Persian Gulf, trying to displace US influence there, trying to arm itself in its Cold War against the Saudis and their influence over the Gulf states. So that grave consequences will come from a nuclear Iran, and they're not just confined to Israel. From Israel's perspective, however, they simply cannot and will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear capability. Israel's survival has always been predicated on possessing a military capability greater than that of its combined enemies. And with Iran potentially acquiring a nuclear weapon, that peace which Israel enjoys, which it clings to, could be shattered. Now, I don't think we will see a nuclear strike from Iran. That would be a totally irrational act from an admittedly irrational state. But I think what we will see is an escalation in hostilities by Iran through its proxies, through Hezbollah, through the desperate regime of al-Assad, and through Hamas, with the hope of then dragging Israel into a regional war. And that is something which Israel does not want. It needs the ability to protect itself, and it simply will not tolerate a nuclear Iran. And I think we have sadly gotten to that point where if the world is not prepared to confront this global problem, I think Israel will have to act unilaterally and do so.
Alex, looking at really, I mean, it's been a very, very eventful year, 2011 in the Middle East. What is your analysis of 2012, and particularly Israel's position in the Middle East?
Well, looking back on the year, it's been a very challenging one, and I think it would be easy to take a good deal of pessimism into the new year, but I prefer to look at the good things which have come in the last year. We've seen the freedom of Gilad Shalit after 5.5 years of terrible, terrible state of affairs, of effectively being buried underground, kept hostage, having no contact with his family. And after 5.5 years, he's now back with his family, which is a wonderful thing. We've seen increased tourism to Israel. We saw 3.2 million tourists come through Ben Gurion Airport, and that's an opportunity. This is 3.2 million people who are seeing Israel firsthand, seeing what a miracle this is, this vibrant young country born out of the desert. And I hope that through that tourism, people will have a greater appreciation for Israel, the culture there, the nightlife, the cohesive society there, and it will give them a new perspective on the Arab-Israeli conflict, which I think is very important. We've seen wonderful advancements in medicine, chemotherapy treatments, AIDS treatments coming from Israel, wonderful projects in agriculture. So I think a lot of good has also come from this year, and I'm very optimistic for the coming year. But that's not to say that Israel doesn't face very serious challenges. We are seeing, as we've spoken about, a nuclear Iran. We're seeing great uncertainty come from the Arab Spring, the fall of stable governments, albeit dictatorships, only to be replaced by Islamists, which pose a great threat. We're seeing the increasing marginalization of more peace-seeking Palestinian movements and the elevation of militant Palestinian movements. So Israel faces great threats, but I'm optimistic, I'm hopeful. Through every potential risk, I think there's an opportunity. And Israel will not miss the chance to seize peace if it presents itself.
Yeah. Got about 3 minutes left of the programme, Alex. Have you got a message for our Christian viewers?
Well, as always, the Jews and the Zionist Federation are deeply grateful to the Christian community for their support. As we've discussed on the programme, Israel faces unprecedented threats, nuclear Iran, instability on its borders. It faces a relentless war of delegitimization in the media, in the United Nations, on campuses. And Israel cannot do this alone. It cannot stand up alone. It desperately needs the help of the Christian Friends of Israel. And we are deeply indebted to the Christians for the support that they give to the Jewish state.
And what practical steps can our wonderful viewers who have a tremendous passion and love for Israel and the Jewish people, how can they get involved in helping Israel and the Jewish people?
Well, advocacy on all levels is very, very important, whether it be through letter writing to mainstream media, whether it be phoning into radio stations, joining groups to discuss tactics for advocacy. There is obviously a very strong Jewish voice in support of Israel, but